The silence of my marriage echoed louder than any scream. I stood at our kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves scatter across our manicured lawn, and wondered when, exactly, Cyril and I had become strangers, sharing the same space. At 39, I was supposed to be living my best life, or so the magazines claimed. Instead, I felt like a ghost, haunting the corners of my own home. Cyril's laptop screen cast a blue glow across his face as he sat at the dining table, the same place he'd been for the past 3 hours. The remains of dinner, a meal I'd carefully prepared, sat cold beside him, barely touched. I watched him from the corner of my eye, remembering a time when dinner meant conversation, laughter, and lingering touches across the table. Now the only sound between us was the steady tap of his keyboard. "Emily." His voice startled me. I turned, hoping to see him looking at me, but his eyes remained fixed on his screen. I pressed my lips together, suppressing a bitter laugh. Of course, another weekend when he'd be too busy to join us. "The cabin?" I echoed, my voice hollow. "It'll be good for you both. You haven't spent much time together lately." I wanted to remind him of what that cabin used to mean to us, how we'd escape there during the early years of our marriage, spending endless hours making love, sharing dreams, and planning our future. The walls still held echoes of our laughter, our whispered promises, our passion, but those memories felt like they belonged to different people now. "What about you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "End of quarter reports." He gestured vaguely at his laptop. "But you two should go. Jason's been different lately. Maybe some mother-son time would help." Different. Yes, our son had been different. At 17, Jason had transformed from my sweet, clingy boy into someone I barely recognized. His shoulders had broadened, his voice had deepened, and a quiet confidence had replaced his teenage awkwardness. Sometimes I caught him watching me with an intensity that made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. "I'll ask him," I said, turning back to the window. The sky had darkened, and my reflection stared back at me, dark hair falling in waves past my shoulders, green eyes that still held their youthful spark despite everything, curves that I maintained through rigorous yoga sessions. I didn't look like most mothers of teenage sons, something my friends often commented on with mixed admiration and suspicion. That night, as I lay in our bed listening to Cyril's steady breathing beside me, I thought about how hard I'd tried to save our marriage. The candlelit dinners he was too busy to attend, the lingerie that remained unworn in my drawer, the emotional conversations that ended in polite dismissal or uncomfortable silence. When had he stopped seeing me? When had I become just another item on his to-do list, perpetually marked pending? I remembered finding his handwritten notes in my purse years ago. "Just because I love you," they'd say, or "thinking of you always." Now his communications came in the form of calendar invites and brief texts about household logistics. The transformation had been so gradual that I hardly noticed it happening, like watching a flower wilt in slow motion. The next morning I approached Jason as he was getting ready for school. He stood at the kitchen counter, his tall frame casting a shadow over the breakfast bar as he poured his protein shake. The morning light caught his features, my green eyes, Cyril's strong jaw, a combination that had resulted in something startlingly handsome. "Your father suggested we spend the weekend at the cabin," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "Just us." He paused mid-pour, his eyes meeting mine in a look that seemed to carry more weight than it should. "Just us," he repeated, and something in his tone made my skin prickle. "Yes, he has work to finish." I busied myself with wiping down the already clean counter. "What do you think?" Jason set down his shake and turned to face me fully. In that moment, I was struck by how adult he looked, how the boy I'd raised had somehow transformed into this man who stood before me. "Sure," he said finally, his voice careful, measured. "It's been a while since we've been there." As I watched him leave for school, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just been set in motion. The cabin had always been a place where the ordinary rules of life seemed to blur and fade, where reality took on a dreamlike quality that made anything seem possible. This time, that thought filled me with both anticipation and dread. I spent the rest of the morning packing, trying to ignore the whispers of memory that each item evoked. The cabin had been our escape, our sanctuary, the place where Cyril and I had been most truly ourselves. Now I was returning with our son, while my husband chose once again to remain behind with his spreadsheets and his emails. Sometimes my mouth appeared on the word spreadsheets and his emails. The woods held secrets, they said. I was about to discover just how deep those secrets could run. Friday afternoon arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air. I watched Jason load our bags into the trunk, struck by the fluid efficiency of his movements. Gone was the gangly teenager who used to trip over his own feet. In his place stood a young man who commanded his space with quiet authority. He caught me staring and held my gaze for a moment too long before turning back to his task. The drive to the cabin stretched before us like a blank canvas. Our usual route took us through winding roads that curved through dense forests, each turn taking us further from civilization. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the familiar landmarks passed by, the old Miller's gas station, the crooked mailbox that never seemed to fall despite its angle, the wooden sign marking the entrance to the private road that led to our cabin. "Remember when we used to play I Spy on these trips?" I asked, desperate to break the heavy silence that had settled between us. "You always chose the hardest things to spot." Jason's lips curved into a slight smile, but his eyes remained fixed on the passing scenery. "I remember," he said softly. "You'd get so frustrated trying to guess. You were a creative child." I glanced at him, noting how his profile had sharpened over the years, losing its boyish softness. "These days I feel like I hardly know what you're thinking anymore." He turned to look at me then, and something in his expression made my breath catch. "Maybe." "You know more than you think, Mum," said he. The way he said Mom felt different somehow, almost like he was trying the word on for size and finding it didn't quite fit anymore. I focused on the road ahead, trying to ignore the way my pulse had quickened at his words. The cabin appeared around the final bend, its dark wood exterior blending with the surrounding pines. It looked smaller than I remembered, more intimate. As I pulled up to the front, memories flooded back. Sorrel carrying me across the threshold, the first time we came here, stolen weekends full of passion and promise, lazy mornings wrapped in each other's arms. Now those same walls would witness a different kind of reunion. Jason moved ahead of me to unlock the door, and I couldn't help but notice how his shoulders filled the doorframe. When had that happened? When had my little boy grown into this masculine presence that seemed to make the air around him vibrate with unspoken tension? Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke, familiar, yet somehow different. Jason set about opening windows and checking the utilities, while I stood in the center of the main room, overwhelmed by how many ghosts this place held. The couch where Sorrel and I used to cuddle, the fireplace that had witnessed countless intimate conversations, the kitchen counter where we'd prepared midnight snacks after making love, each surface held a memory that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "The generator's working," Jason called from outside. We should have power and hot water. I busied myself unpacking our groceries, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I thought we could make pasta tonight, I said when he came back in. Your favorite, with the vodka sauce. He stepped closer, reaching past me to grab a water bottle from the counter. His arm brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. Sounds perfect, he murmured, his voice lower than usual. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further, and Jason suggested building a fire. I watched him arrange the logs with careful precision, his movements deliberate and assured. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the room. I opened a bottle of wine, pouring myself a generous glass to calm my nerves. Would you like some? I offered, more out of habit than expectation. He paused, considering. Actually, yes, he said, moving to join me on the couch. I think I would. I hesitated, maternal instincts warring with something else I couldn't quite name. You're still underage. Mom. He fixed me with those intense green eyes. My eyes, I realized with a start. I think we're past that kind of pretense, don't you? I poured him a glass with trembling hands, wondering what exactly he meant by those words. As we sat there, the fire crackling between us and the wine warming our blood, I became acutely aware of how alone we were. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the woods around us seemed to press in closer, as if they too were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. You've changed, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Since we were last here, you seem different. Different how? I asked, but a part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He took another sip of wine, his eyes never leaving mine, more real somehow, less like my mother and more like... He trailed off, but the weight of his unspoken words hung heavy in the air between us. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and I jumped slightly, spilling a few drops of wine on my shirt. Here, let me, Jason said, reaching for a napkin. His fingers brushed against my collarbone as he dabbed at the stain, and I forgot how to breathe. Jason, I whispered, but I wasn't sure if it was a warning or a play. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew we were approaching a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the wine had softened the edges of my judgment, and the familiar ache of loneliness that had been my constant companion these past years seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. As darkness settled outside our windows, the woods kept their silence, holding our secrets close, like a lover's whisper. The wine bottle stood empty between us, a silent witness to the unraveling of boundaries. The fire had burned low, casting amber shadows that softened the edges of reality. I knew I should get up, should bid Jason good night and retreat to the safety of my room, but something held me there, something stronger than maternal instinct or social propriety. Tell me about you and Dad, Jason said suddenly, his voice cutting through the crackling of dying embers. What happened? Tell us the truth. I shifted on the couch, aware of how close we'd drifted during our conversation. What do you mean? Don't pretend, Mom. His eyes caught the firelight, turning them almost gold. I see how he treats you. How long has it been since he really looked at you? Since he saw you as a woman, not just a convenience? The words struck like physical blows, each one exposing a truth I'd tried to bury. That's not appropriate, Jason, isn't it? He leaned closer and I caught the scent of his cologne. When had he started wearing cologne? I see you, Mom. Every day, I watch you try so hard to get his attention. The dinners he ignores, the conversations he dismisses, the way you still look at him, hoping he'll notice you're wearing something new. My throat tightened. I should check the firewood supply, I said, standing abruptly. The room swayed slightly, Whether from the wine or emotion, I couldn't tell. The night air hit me like a slap when I stepped onto the porch. Stars wheeled overhead, impossibly bright this far from civilization. I heard the door open behind me, followed by Jason's steady footsteps. "Mum, wait." His hand caught my arm, gentle but firm. I was, but not from the cold. "We need more wood for the morning," I insisted, pulling away and heading toward the wood pile. The path was treacherous in the dark, and my foot caught on an exposed root. I stumbled, crying out as my ankle twisted. Jason caught me before I hit the ground, his arms wrapping around me with surprising strength. Time seemed to freeze as we stood there, my back pressed against his chest, his breath warm against my neck. I should have pulled away immediately, should have thanked him politely and established proper distance. Instead, I found myself leaning into his warmth, my body responding to the first genuine embrace I'd felt in years. "I've got you," he whispered, and something in his voice made me tremble. "Jason?" I breathed, but the name caught in my throat as his fingers traced the line of my jaw. This was wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed it was wrong, but my skin burned where he touched me, awakening sensations I'd thought long dead. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me I'm the only one who lies awake at night, thinking about how different things could be, how they should be." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The world had narrowed to this moment, to the heat of his body so close to mine, to the way his eyes reflected starlight and desire. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat screaming danger and desire in equal measure. "We can't," I managed, but even I heard the weakness in my protest. "Why not?" His thumb brushed my lower lip, and I gasped at the intimacy of the gesture. "Because it's wrong? Because society says it's forbidden? What about what feels right? What about what we both need?" The air between us crackled with electricity, with possibilities both terrifying and tempting. I could feel the years of loneliness pressing in on me, the weight of neglect and desire and forbidden thoughts. Jason's other hand slid to the small of my back, drawing me closer. "Just once," he whispered, his lips now inches from mine. "Just tonight. No one ever needs to know. Let me show you how a man should treat you. Let me make you feel wanted again." Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second an eternity of choice and consequence. In the distance, another wolf howled, a lonely, yearning sound that seemed to echo the ache in my own heart. The woods around us held their breath, waiting to see what secret they would need to keep. I knew in that moment that whatever choice I made would change everything forever. The safe, familiar world of mother and son would shatter, replaced by something darker, more complex, more dangerous. But hadn't it already changed? Hadn't we been moving toward this moment since we first arrived? Or perhaps even before? Jason's fingers tangled in my hair, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the inevitability of what would happen next. The night wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last fragments of my resistance, of the person I used to be. It was frightening, an adrenaline rush in my system so intense that I could barely breathe. Sometimes, I would later realize, the biggest mistakes feel exactly like salvation in the moment you make them. Dawn arrived like an accusation, harsh light streaming through frost-covered windows. I lay in my bed, watching dust motes dance in the morning rays, feeling the weight of the previous night pressing down on my chest. The cabin's familiar creaks and groans seemed different now, as if the very walls were whispering of what they had witnessed. In the quiet morning hours, shame crept in like a tide, threatening to drown me. What kind of mother was I? What kind of woman? The questions echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. I could hear Jason moving around in the main room, the sound of his footsteps both familiar and terrifyingly strange. When I finally emerged from my room, he stood at the kitchen counter, methodically preparing breakfast. The domesticity of the scene felt like a mockery. Eggs sizzling in the pan, coffee brewing, morning light painting everything in deceptively normal hues. He looked up as I entered, and the intensity in his eyes made my heart stutter. "Good morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. How could he sound so composed when my entire world had tilted on its axis? "Jason," I began, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I possibly say? How does a mother address her son the morning after crossing an unforgivable line? He set a plate of eggs in front of me, the gesture achingly ordinary. "We should eat," he said quietly. "Dad texted, he'll be here in a few hours. Cyrell." My husband's name hit me like a physical blow. Soon he would walk through that door, completely unaware that his world had been irreversibly altered. Would he be able to see it on our faces? Would the guilt radiate from us? Like heat. We ate in silence, the scrape of forks against plates the only sound. Outside, the morning had bloomed bright and clear, as if nature itself was mocking the darkness of what we'd done. I watched Jason as he ate, trying to reconcile the man before me with the child I'd raised. Had I always been blind to the way he'd looked at me, or was this something that had grown in the shadows of our failing family? "We need to talk about this," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason set down his fork, meeting my gaze steadily. "Do we? Will talking change anything?" "Everything's changed," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Has it?" He leaned forward, and I forced myself not to flinch away. "Or has it just become honest?" "How long have we been pretending, Mom? Pretending Dad's distance doesn't hurt you, pretending I haven't seen how lonely you are, pretending I haven't wanted—" "Stop!" The word came out sharper than I intended. "We can't. This can't happen again. Ever." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain? Resignation? Or perhaps something darker. "You can say that now, in the daylight. But what about the next time Dad chooses his work over you? The next time you lie awake, feeling unwanted and alone?" His words struck too close to home, exposing truths I wasn't ready to face. I stood abruptly, needing distance, air, escape. But in the confined space of the cabin, there was nowhere to run from what we'd done. The sound of tires on gravel made us both freeze. Cyrell was early. Panic clawed at my throat as footsteps approached the door. In those few seconds before it opened, I saw our secret stretching before us like a dark road, something we would have to carry, separately but together, for the rest of our lives. "Hello?" Cyrell's voice rang out, cheerful and oblivious. He entered, stomping snow from his boots. "The storm didn't strand you two, did it?" I forced a smile, the muscles in my face feeling stiff and foreign. We managed. He crossed to kiss my cheek, the gesture perfunctory and cold. How had I never noticed before how empty his touches had become? Or had I noticed? And was that emptiness what led me here? "Thanks for watching out for your mom, son," Cyrell said, clapping Jason on the shoulder. Jason tensed under his father's touch, a reaction so subtle only I noticed it. "Of course," Jason replied, his voice steady but his eyes finding mine over his father's shoulder. In that look I saw everything we could never say aloud: desire, guilt, understanding, and something else that made my heart ache with its complexity. As we packed the car for the drive home, I realized that the woods had kept their promise. They had hidden our secret well, wrapped it in layers of silence and shadow, but secrets have weight, and I could feel this one settling into my bones, becoming part of who I was now. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Sorrel chatted about work, his voice creating a normal backdrop to the turmoil in my mind. In the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of Jason, his face unreadable, his presence both comfort and torment. That night, lying beside my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and wondered about the nature of love and loneliness, about the choices we make when darkness falls and the world narrows to desperate needs. The woods may keep our secrets, but some truths can't be buried, no matter how deep we try to hide them. I thought about the way Jason had looked at me this morning, about the unspoken promise in his eyes. This wasn't over. Whatever had awakened in that cabin wouldn't quietly go back to sleep. Like the wolves in the forest, it would lurk in the shadows, waiting for another moment of weakness, another chance to emerge. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I wasn't sure what frightened me more. The possibility that it might happen again, or the possibility that I might want it to.